Hi everyone, and welcome to the video lecture Preschool Development. My name is Melissa Kay, and this is Occupational Therapy 212, Development Through the Lifespan. Let's get started. Our objectives today are to describe preschoolers' development across a number of domains, to explain the development of tool use and prehension patterns, and we're going to address that more fully in class in a lab, to quantify school readiness. So at the end of the preschool period, kids are getting ready to go to kindergarten, and that is a huge developmental milestone that happens. We're also going to look at differentiating typical characteristics of preschool play and describing the cultural and contextual factors affecting development. First, it's important to understand what exactly a preschooler is. Typically, a child who's between the ages of 3 and 5 years of age and is attending preschool or some sort of early education program is termed a preschooler. As I've said in earlier videos, it's important to understand development through the lens of various different theorists. And so our theorists today are Erikson, who we visited with before and looks at psychosocial development. He says that this stage is characterized by initiative versus guilt. And basically, the phase is activated by social challenges, and the child either takes initiative and becomes more confident in his or her presentation to the outside world, or doesn't and retreats into a state of guilt. So the child begins to make or construct things in play, accepts their parents as role models, and is generally very busy. Piaget would place the preschool child in the pre-operational stage, which again is from 2 to 7 years. So it starts in toddlerhood and continues into the preschool age and even into school a little bit. Once again, just to review, symbolic function comes into play in the pre-operational phase. So that is using signs and symbols to stand for something else, both in terms of using language, expressive and written, and pictures, and more pretend types of play. The child who is in a pre-operational stage is also egocentric, so they cannot see anything from anyone else's viewpoint. They're very focused on themselves, and that's typical. And they are also able to only focus on one aspect of a stimulus or a situation to the exclusion of everything else, and that is termed centration. We're going to introduce a couple new theorists today and go into them just in a little bit of depth. The first is Bandura, and Bandura is all about social development and social interaction. And so he talks about modeling, in other words, the way that young children watch each other and then learn from each other through watching and modeling, and also vicarious reinforcement. So getting reinforcement from other sources besides internally. Finally, Chess and Thomas talk about dimensions of temperament. And temperament is a construct or a concept that basically means kind of how do you basically feel about the world, right? So we have personality and we have temperament. And temperament, to me anyway, is a more foundational kind of concept. That is, how do you interact with the world as a person? So the types of factors that come up are activity level, whether the child is very active or not so active, the rhythms of their day, their style of approach and withdrawal to new activities, familiar activities, people, both adults and peers, their adaptability, their sensory thresholds, the quality of their moods. So some people, as you know, as an adult, are just pretty happy, and other people are not so happy, just on a general baseline. We also think about intensity of reactions to various stimuli, level of distractibility, their persistence, and the ability to attend. So this idea of temperament really comes into play and then continues throughout the lifespan. Let's talk for a minute about the young child's brain, which is super interesting. It grows to 90% of the adult size by 6 years of age. So just past preschool, we have almost an adult-sized brain. So what that means is that we've made many of the connections that need to be made, and refinement and inhibition are what take place in the middle childhood school years. But in preschool, we're still growing those connections. There's also a huge amount of language development. And interestingly, in the 3 to 6 year old, the left hemisphere, in other words, responsible for expressive language, is actually larger than the right because language is coming in at such a huge rate and plays such a major role in this period of development. We're also making connections from the cerebellar area responsible for movement and movement control to the cortex. So the cortex we haven't talked about so much in the newborn or the toddler, but in the preschool, we're starting to think about those cognitive connections that happen in the cortex, or the centers of higher learning and higher thought. Finally, we also have some lateralization happening in our preschoolers. What that means is that both the brain and the body are integrating the two sides, the left and the right sides. So how that manifests is through handedness. For a 5 to 7 year old, they're beginning to develop handedness, or a hand dominance. And typically it's either right or left. Very few children are purely ambidextrous, although some kids very typically will use one hand as dominant, for example, to write, and a different hand to cut. There may be also mixed patterns of dominance between hand, eye, and foot. So that's also pretty typical. Before the age of about 5 to 7, we have hand preference. So the child will tend to gravitate towards the use of one hand, but it's not set firmly until 5 to 7 years of age. So the brain is just exploding in the preschool years. We also have a huge period of physical development in the preschool years. Muscle strength and size increases, which then feeds the ability to do more sophisticated motor activities. Energy increases, although preschoolers are still likely to nap. Endurance is limited because they have energy, they spend energy, and they run out of energy, right? So thus the napping. Gross and fine motor ability refine and increase in skill. Fine motor development includes hand preference, hand dominance, prehension patterns, and a number of the factors that I indicated we'll talk about in class, and you can also read about in your resources. We also see an increase in dynamic and static postural stability, and equilibrium responses or reactions emerge. So in the toddler, we talked about rotational movements, and now we're talking about equilibrium reactions, which is the balancing of two sides of the body to maintain stability and balance. And we can talk more about that as well. Movement in the preschooler becomes smooth and fluid and flows. So the toddler moving is a little bit jerky and off balance and unstable, but in the preschooler, we see this huge amount of refinement and maturation. And calibration emerges. So the force, speed, and directional control that just started in our toddler really takes the fore and increases in ability and skill in our preschoolers. In terms of fine motor development, as I said, we'll be exploring this in class, but we think about prehension patterns, in other words, grasp patterns, and we think about both gross grasp and precision grasp. So a gross grasp is a whole hand grasp, and a precision grasp relies on the fingers specifically. We'll also be looking at pencil grasp patterns and the development of that, and in-hand manipulation skills. So in other words, the ability to move something within the hand itself, move a small object. The preschooler also begins to develop graphomotor skills, and graphomotor skills are defined as the ingredients that go into drawing and writing. We're going to also review this information in class, but I want to give you a little bit of an introduction. So conceptual and perceptual motor skills are involved in drawing and writing, as well as motor skills within the hand. So it's a graphomotor skills are a complex kind of constellation of skills that involve the hand, but also extend to including the brain, the eyes, the proprioceptive and tactile systems. So they're really pulling together a lot of domains of development. The sequence of learning graphomotor or drawing and writing skills is as follows. First, the child is able to trace, so write on top of what someone else has drawn or written. Then to imitate, so I do it and you're doing it at the same time. Then copy, so I give you a piece of paper that has something written or drawn on it. And finally, the child becomes able to create new content. The next area we want to look at is sensory. In the preschooler, there's an active exploration of the environment through many of the senses, but especially through the visual sense. Visual exploration becomes the primary means for learning and comprises 80% of what a child takes in. So we move from proprioceptive, vestibular, and tactile to primarily becoming visual beings, and the auditory system also kicks into play. Visual skills continue to develop in terms of scanning and visual discrimination. The touch system also continues to develop, especially in the area of discriminative touch and haptic perception. So that is discriminative touch is this fine ability to identify details and to therefore refine precision with motor skill that happens from very fine and precise tactile ability. And then haptic perception also increases, and that is kind of one of the kinesthetic skills. So it's discriminative touch plus memory of touch. So it's involved in being able to manipulate things without looking at them, right? Purely by the sense of touch. There's also the development of self-regulation at this phase of life, the preschool years. So self-regulation, again, is the ability to moderate or modulate or mediate one's level of alertness, focus, attention, and activity level given the demands of the activity, the context, and the environment. It's partially about increasing one's task behavior and the ability to regulate one's own behavior. So just because I feel like falling on the ground screaming, which a 2-year-old would do, the preschooler doesn't necessarily go there. So that's a piece of self-regulation. They also maintain a consistent and effective pace throughout the steps of an assigned task, so they're able to persist with tasks. They also are able to initiate and complete tasks, so they do the whole 9 yards, initiate, persist, and complete tasks. They can focus in a distracting or busy environment, which is very important for the preschooler because they're in preschool, which is a distracting and busy environment. And they gain in independence, social and emotional regulation and independence, which is very important in school, and it fosters independent work habits. So self-regulation in the preschooler becomes very important, both for the phase of development and also to prepare the child for entry into school. Communication is another area that is of prime importance to the preschooler. It's a sensitive period where language, both receptive and expressive, increase. Vocabulary increases to 1,000 words by age 3. Syntax and semantics increase and refine, so the child is more able to construct sentences and to convey thoughts accurately and precisely. Verbalization becomes the primary mode of communication, taking over for pointing, gesturing, making noises, getting an adult and pulling their hand towards something. So children become verbal during this phase. And communication also extends beyond speech, and children that are in the preschool age are engaging in nonverbal communication as well, which includes eye contact, facial expression, posture, gestures, and the amount of personal space that a child maintains between themselves and someone else. The degree of formality and the amount of eye contact, the amount of space really varies across cultural groups. So we can't make a blanket statement about how much is the right amount. All we can say is that we need to take culture into account when determining this. Interestingly, a lot of children with autism are diagnosed in the late toddler to early preschool years. And part of the reason is that they're not developing, and it becomes apparent that they're not developing language according to this sort of general plan, and they're not developing the nonverbal behaviors like eye contact, facial expression, an awareness of personal space and social cues around that. And so that's a piece of why diagnosis happens around 2 to 3 or 4 years of age, even though we see signs of autism much earlier. So just a little aside. We also see an increase in ADLS and IADLS. So in terms of activities of daily living, the child in preschool age is starting to dress themselves more fully, and definitely undressing comes first. They are mastering toileting if they haven't already. They are starting by about 4 years of age to negotiate zippers and shoes and socks, with the exception of they will not be tying shoes until about 5, 6, 7, even 7 years of age. And a note about toileting that being continent with urine comes before bowel control. The order of skills varies according to culture, and there is a social pressure, especially in the U.S., to be independent in ADLs by the time you're in preschool, or by the end of preschool, certainly, because when you enter kindergarten, there's an expectation that you'll be independent. In terms of IADLs, preschoolers are continuing to participate in home chores. They may help take care of a pet. They may run errands with a parent, be responsible for yard care, and all of this is with adult assist. So they're not independent yet, but they're starting to take an interest and also take responsibility for family type activities.